The air in the old Boston brownstone was thick with the scent of dust and roses, a fragrance that clung to the velvet curtains and seeped from the hardwood floors. It was a scent Caleb remembered, a ghost from a life he'd purposefully abandoned. 3 years hadn't changed the address, but the man who answered the door was a stranger carved from familiar stone. Julian was taller, his frame leaner, and his once short hair now fell past his shoulders in a cascade of dusty rose, a color both beautiful and cold. For a heartbeat, recognition flickered in his eyes, quickly consumed by a storm of raw fury. His hand shot out, clamping around Caleb's throat and slamming him back against the wall. The impact rattled Caleb's teeth. Julian's voice was a low growl, laced with 3 years of bitterness. He asked what gave him the audacity to return after running for so long. The pressure wasn't enough to steal his breath, just enough to be a threat. A flicker of the old defiance surfaced, Caleb's voice a low murmur. He'd come back, he claimed, just to apologize. And maybe, he added with a ghost of a smile, to see how Julian planned to destroy him. The rumors had been vicious, even reaching him across the Atlantic. A humorless laugh escaped Julian's lips, the grip on Caleb's neck tightening, eliciting a choked gasp. He sneered, asking if Caleb had run out of money again, if he was back to ply his old trade. The words were sharp, a stark contrast to the gentle boy he'd been in college. But Caleb knew he'd earned this venom. He had orchestrated their ending to be as ugly as possible, leaving no room for hope. He had to endure the fallout. He softened his voice, tilting his head to graze his cheek against Julian's jaw. He wasn't short on cash, he whispered he was short on him. He then brazenly asked if Mr. Hayes would consider taking him back. Julian scoffed, a sound of pure disdain, and shoved him away. Caleb stumbled and fell to the floor. Julian loomed over him, his expression iced over, questioning the absurd notion that he could still harbor any affection for Caleb. Caleb rubbed his neck, a dull ache spreading through his shoulders. And Omega's body was fragile. Back when he was a beta, a little roughhousing like this would have been nothing. Julian's gaze locked onto the reddening marks on his skin, a flicker of concern warring with his anger before he stamped it out. He accused Caleb of learning new tricks abroad, of becoming more manipulative. Caleb saw his opening. He lowered his head, hiding his expression, and let his shoulders tremble. He clutched his throat, looking up at Julian through watery eyes. The feigned vulnerability worked. Julian hesitated, then bent down, his voice tight as he asked where it hurt. That was the Julian he knew, the one who couldn't resist a damsel in distress. Closing the distance, Caleb lunged, wrapping his arms around Julian's neck and crushing their lips together. The world exploded in the scent of roses, rich and intoxicating. It was Julian's true scent, unfiltered and overwhelming. So this was what being an Omega felt like. It wasn't so bad. Julian froze for a second before shoving him back with force. He demanded to know what Caleb thought he was doing. Caleb, savoring the taste on his lips, simply smiled and stated the obvious. He was kissing his soon-to-be boyfriend again. Julian pointed a shaking finger toward the door and told him to get out, declaring he didn't recycle his ex-boyfriends. Caleb tilted his head, feigning confusion. He reminded Julian of his promise to destroy him, wondering why he was hesitating now that Caleb had delivered himself to his doorstep. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Julian's face before he turned away, muttering that it wouldn't be tonight. Caleb understood. He stood up, glancing at the dark sky outside. He pointed out that it was 3 in the morning and Julian was really going to throw him out. Julian insisted it wasn't his problem. With a final, resigned sigh, Caleb walked out. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. Caleb slumped against his luggage, the chill of the polished marble floor seeping through his jeans. He'd miscalculated. The resentment ran deeper than he'd anticipated. Just as he began to wonder which all-night diner he could wait in, the door creaked open. Julian stood there, his face a mask of self-loathing. He nudged Caleb's shoe with his foot and told him to get inside. A triumphant smile spread across Caleb's face. He grabbed his suitcase and breezed past Julian, who warned him it was for one night only. The smile vanished from Caleb's face. He claimed he wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. It wasn't a lie. The jet lag was a heavy anchor, promising a deep, disorienting sleep. Julian cursed under his breath and disappeared into his bedroom. The pale pink hair shimmered as he walked away, a painful reminder of a long-forgotten conversation. Julian had always hated long hair, finding it a hassle. It was Caleb, the art student obsessed with aesthetics, who had told him that long hair would suit him, that it would make him look ethereal. Caleb's feet, acting on their own accord, followed him. The bedroom was dark, but the scent of roses was even stronger here. Moonlight sliced through the window, illuminating Julian's profile as he lay on the bed. His features were still perfect, the high cheekbones and straight nose that Caleb had once spent hours sketching from memory. He slipped under the covers beside him. Julian's eyes snapped open. He asked if Caleb truly believed he wouldn't hurt him. Caleb just smiled, inviting him to try. Julian rolled over, his eyes cold in the dim light. He questioned Caleb's reappearance, reminding him of how cleanly he had walked away. Caleb admitted it was all a carefully constructed act, a lie he had to sell to a boy who was too blinded by love to see reason. He confessed his regret and asked for another chance. Julian's answer was a flat no, insisting he had no interest in Caleb anymore. But the air was thick with his pheromones, a lie his own body was telling. Caleb was done playing games. He straddled Julian's waist, pinning him down. He asked if he was interested now. A shiver ran through Julian's body, a vein pulsing in his neck. He ordered Caleb to get off. Caleb ignored him, studying the way the moonlight sharpened the angles of his face. He'd matured, the softness of youth replaced by an alpha's distinct presence. Even with the soft hair, there was no mistaking his power. The stomach beneath his hands was firm, a wall of muscle. He leaned in close, his breath warm against Julian's ear, asking what he would do if he refused. Julian's eyes darkened. He grabbed Caleb's hands, his voice strained. He warned him to get off while he still had his sanity. Caleb only pushed further, his tongue tracing the shell of Julian's ear. He taunted him, wondering if age had mellowed him, if something was wrong. He unbuttoned Julian's shirt with his teeth, his lips trailing down the column of his throat. The scent of roses was dizzying, intoxicating. With a sudden surge of strength, Julian reversed their positions, pinning Caleb beneath him. He growled, asking what made Caleb think he would fall for a beta a second time. The word stung. Caleb went cold, then used his knee to strike Julian's abdomen. The intimacy between them was one thing, but bringing his designation into it was a low blow. The atmosphere, once charged with desire, was now thick with resentment. Julian grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Caleb needed. He wriggled free and sat up. He stated calmly that if Julian wasn't interested, he wouldn't force himself on him. He added that Julian was right. He could get what he needed from any alpha. Why did it have to be his useless ex-boyfriend? As he moved to get off the bed, Julian's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist again. He loomed over him, his face a mask of fury, asking who else Caleb planned to scam. Caleb shot back that it was none of his business, and it certainly wouldn't be him. Julian's pheromones flooded the room, sharp and suing, a clear sign of his anger. He pressed down, his face moving toward Caleb's neck, noting the pheromone patch there. He sneered, questioning why a beta would even wear one. His teeth grazed the patch, sending a jolt of pleasure and pain through Caleb's system. It was the most intense stimulation he'd felt since his second presentation. Julian's voice was rough as he tore the patch away, declaring that Caleb had asked for this. The small white gland was exposed to the air, and with it, a delicate, clean scent of pine nuts bled into the room, mingling with the roses. Julian froze. He pulled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He asked the question that hung between them. "You're an Omega?" Caleb propped himself up, meeting his shocked gaze. He confirmed it, asking if it wasn't obvious. Julian seemed lost, asking when it had happened. Just a few days ago, Caleb explained. He'd flown back the moment he found out. He told Julian that since he was now an Omega, Julian's partner could only be him. Julian's expression shifted through a storm of emotions before he pulled Caleb into a tight embrace, burying his face in his neck. He told him to sleep. The blocker patch was replaced, and Julian held him as if he was afraid Caleb would vanish by morning, just like he had 3 years ago. It was just like the old days, lying in his arms, safe and warm. Back in college, their relationship had been a whirlwind. Caleb, the quiet beta from a neglectful family, had been sent to the prestigious university to find a wealthy match. Julian was the school's golden boy, the heir to the Hayes fortune. He was everything Caleb wasn't supposed to want, yet he was the only thing he saw. Caleb had engineered their meeting, beating him in 3 consecutive exams by a razor-thin margin just to get his attention. It worked. Julian had cornered him one evening, demanding to know if he had a problem with him. Caleb had smiled and told him that he had more than a problem. He had an interest. Their love had been an open secret, a rebellion against their prescribed futures. It came to a head at a charity gala where Julian's parents announced his engagement to an Omega from another powerful family. Julian had rejected it on the spot, grabbing Caleb's hand and walking out into the night. They had lived on love in a cramped, off-campus apartment, surviving on instant noodles and stolen kisses. It was bliss until Julian's mother found him. She wasn't the villain Caleb had expected. She was graceful, kind, and terrified for her son. She laid out a medical file. Pheromonal dysregulation syndrome, a rare genetic condition that meant Julian's body couldn't regulate his own alpha pheromones. Without the soothing bond of a compatible Omega, it would eventually kill him. A beta could offer no relief. She offered Caleb a cashier's check and a way out for his own family's troubles. But it wasn't the money that convinced him. It was the desperate love of a mother for her child, a love Caleb had never known. He couldn't let Julian lose that, so he chose to let Julian live, even if it meant their love had to die. He broke up with Julian that night, delivering the cruelest lines he could imagine. He told him it was about the money, that their time together was just a game. He watched the light die in Julian's eyes as he called him a worthless trust fund baby, and then he walked away, never looking back. Now, lying in his arms, Caleb felt the ghost of that pain. Julian stirred in his sleep, murmuring his name. Caleb turned and pressed a soft kiss to his trembling eyelids. He wasn't going anywhere this time. The next morning, Julian's bedroom door was locked. Caleb spent the day as a ghost in the apartment, peeling off his blocker and letting his pine nut scent permeate every room. A silent, fragrant siege. The opportunity he was waiting for came a few days later. Julian had locked himself in his room since dawn, but the scent of roses seeping from under the door was thick and distressingly sweet. His rut had arrived. Caleb kicked the door open. A large lump was huddled under the blankets. He tore them back. Julian was feverish, his eyes glazed over. He didn't seem to recognize him. Caleb leaned down and kissed him. After a moment of hesitation, Julian responded with a desperate, fiery passion. This was better. An alpha in his rut was far more agreeable. When the kiss broke, Julian stared at him, his face flushed. Caleb pulled open his own collar, releasing more of his scent, asking if Julian recognized him now. Julian mumbled his name, his head nuzzling against Caleb's chest. He stripped off Julian's shirt, only to find he'd wrapped himself in the bedsheet from the night they'd shared. He tried to pull it away, but Julian held on with surprising strength. Caleb gently cradled his face, murmuring that he was right here, that he didn't need the sheet. Julian relaxed, his teeth starting to nibble at Caleb's neck. Caleb guided him, telling him to bite his gland, to mark him. But Julian seemed confused, his senses muddled by the rut. He just licked the skin, sending shivers down Caleb's spine. Exasperated, Caleb grabbed his hair, pulling him back slightly. He questioned if all alphas in a rut were this clueless. That seemed to trigger something. Julian surged up, reversing their positions again. He was more lucid now, repeating Caleb's name like a mantra. He began to scent him, his nose trailing from his hair down to his chest, like he was trying to memorize him. Caleb couldn't take it anymore. He pulled Julian's face to his and bit his lip, demanding he stop sniffing and do something real. Their reunion was chaotic and consuming. Afterwards, Julian was different. The lock on his bedroom door disappeared. Every night, Caleb would slip into his bed, and Julian would pull him close, holding him tightly in his sleep. But there was a new barrier. Julian now wore a blocker patch over his own gland. One night, Caleb decided he'd had enough. While Julian slept, he reached for the patch. A hand caught his wrist in the dark. Julian's voice was thick with sleep as he asked what he was doing. Caleb leaned in and tried to bite the patch off. Julian pulled away instantly. Caleb sat up, frustrated. He explained the doctors. As a late-presenting Omega, he needed a mark, even a temporary one, to stabilize his hormones, or he could go into a sudden, uncontrolled heat. He demanded to know why Julian was being so difficult. Julian adjusted his patch before answering. He stated flatly that he hadn't agreed to get back together. He was merely accepting Caleb's pursuit. Caleb was dumbfounded. Pursuit? They had slept together. Julian calmly explained that he interpreted Caleb's recent actions as an aggressive courtship. A laugh escaped Caleb's lips. It was absurd, but he played along. He asked for a progress report. Julian simply pulled him back down to the bed, telling him it depended on his performance. Lying in the dark, Caleb sighed. He confessed his real fear, that he wanted to know if his pheromones could actually soothe Julian's condition, that he was terrified of a public heat. Julian's voice was a muffled whisper against his shoulder. He said it would be better if Caleb were still a beta. Caleb asked if he had some kind of prejudice, but Julian denied it, offering no other explanation. A month passed. Caleb waited for Julian's next rut, but he seemed to be actively avoiding it, and him. One night, he didn't come home at all. Frustrated and hurt, Caleb went to a trendy downtown lounge to clear his head. And there he was, Julian, surrounded by a crowd, and Omega leaning in to share a drink with him, mouth to mouth. Julian's eyes met Caleb's across the room, and he tilted his head back, accepting. Rage, white-hot and blinding, surged through Caleb. He stormed over, shoved the Omega aside, and slapped Julian across the face. The bar went silent. He demanded to know if this was fun, sleeping with him at night while playing the field. Julian just looked at him, a strange smile on his lips, and asked if he was jealous. Caleb grabbed his hair, pulling his head back. He told him to stay away, that he was disgusting. Julian's smile vanished. He said that this was how he'd been living for the past 3 years. If Caleb couldn't accept it, he should leave. Caleb grabbed a freshly opened bottle of tequila from the bar and poured it over Julian's head. He told him that now that he was back, Julian needed to clean up his act. Julian's face went cold. He unleashed his pheromones, a wave of pressure that forced Caleb to stumble back. He asked why he should do anything Caleb wanted, sneering that Caleb seemed to have an inflated sense of self-importance. The words were a physical blow. He had come back for Julian, had bared his soul and his body, and this was his response. Julian stepped closer, liquor dripping from his hair. He reminded Caleb that he had shown up uninvited, that it was all a game. He was just returning the favor for what Caleb had done to him. Caleb stared into his cold eyes, and suddenly, all he could see was the boy he'd hurt so long ago. He felt a desperate urge to close the distance, to erase the cruelty. He lunged forward and bit Julian's lip, hard. He told him to shut his mouth if he was only going to say such ugly things. The taste of tequila and blood filled his mouth. When he pulled away, Julian was laughing. He pointed out Caleb's hypocrisy, asking if he wasn't disgusted a moment ago. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. Caleb shot back that he'd washed him off so he wasn't dirty anymore. He demanded a straight answer. What did Julian want? Julian's expression turned mocking. He claimed he'd had Caleb investigated. He knew Caleb needed an alpha's mark and accused him of coming back only for that. He told him he was done playing and Caleb should find someone else. Caleb couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked if Julian truly believed that was the only reason. Julian just raised an eyebrow. The rage boiled over. Caleb yelled that Julian was an idiot. He had left because of his damned illness, and he had come back to see if his pheromones, and Omega's pheromones, could help him. It was always about him. He knew Julian wasn't stupid. He knew Julian must have figured out the real reason he'd left years ago. Julian's mask cracked for a second. His voice was quiet but firm. He said he knew, but it didn't change anything. 3 years was a long time. He looked Caleb dead in the eye and asked him to consider the possibility that he genuinely didn't love him anymore. Otherwise, why wouldn't he have marked him? The world tilted on its axis. Caleb searched his eyes for a lie, for any flicker of the boy he loved, but found only cold, detached mockery. His voice was a dry rasp. He admitted he hadn't considered that. Someone in the crowd snickered. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. Julian told him they should part on good terms. Caleb's shock curdled into a bitter laugh. He called Julian pathetic for letting him stay, for sleeping with him, all for the sake of some petty revenge. He felt utterly drained. He collapsed onto a nearby sofa and told Julian to go. He watched his back recede through the crowd until he was gone. A few days later, Caleb went back to the brownstone to retrieve his laptop. He knocked, but there was no answer. On a whim, he tried the fingerprint scanner. The lock clicked open. He hadn't deleted his print from 3 years ago. The moment he stepped inside, he was hit by an overpowering wave of roses. The rut was back, and this time it was violent. The apartment was destroyed. Furniture was overturned. a lamp shattered. An arm snaked around his waist, and a hot, desperate kiss landed on his neck. It was Julian, completely lost to his instincts. Caleb pushed him back, his eyes taking in the chaos. Julian clung to him, whimpering like a lost animal. Caleb sighed. This was his chance to get some answers and maybe some payback. He tilted Julian's head back, his lips trailing down his neck. He pushed aside the curtain of pink hair to get to the gland, to finally breathe in Julian's undiluted scent. And then he froze. A jagged, silvery scar bisected the delicate skin, a mark of brutal, intentional violence. Permanent mutilation. This was what the hair was for. Not aesthetics, but concealment. His hand trembled as he traced the raised tissue. He asked what had happened. Julian, lost in his haze, just kissed his fingertips. It was clear he wouldn't get any answers from him now. He dragged Julian to the bedroom. There, on the pillow, was the white t-shirt Julian had torn off him days ago, wrinkled and dirty. The rut was worse this time. As Julian's hands roamed his body, Caleb's mind was stuck on the scar. He needed to know the truth. He found Marcus Thorne, Julian's biggest rival from college. He knew Marcus would relish the opportunity to detail Julian's downfall. Marcus was thrilled. He recounted how Julian had gone off the rails after Caleb left. The reckless driving, the drinking, all of it culminating in a hospital stay where his PDS was officially diagnosed and found to be rapidly advancing. The Hayes family had frantically searched for a compatible Omega. They found one and pushed her on him during a rut, hoping to force a bond. Instead, Julian had taken a shard of glass and sliced his own gland open. The Omega had fled in terror. Marcus laughed as he delivered the final, devastating blow. The injury had permanently damaged the gland. Doctors warned that any future attempt to mark an Omega could trigger a fatal rejection response in Julian. No Omega would go near him after that. The family had even tried to procure a beta for him, just for physical release, but Julian had beaten the man bloody. Caleb's hands were bleeding where his nails had dug into his palms. He finally understood. It would be better if you were still a beta. It wasn't prejudice. It was fear. He raced back to the apartment. Julian was there, the place cleaned up, his composure restored. He looked up as Caleb entered and coolly asked what he'd forgotten this time. Caleb ignored the pretense. He asked if Julian had planned on dying without ever telling him the truth. He screamed that he had left so Julian could live, not so he could destroy himself. The mask finally shattered. Julian looked down, his voice barely a whisper. He was a damaged alpha. Caleb yelled back that he didn't care. Julian looked at him then. His eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. He cared. He couldn't risk it. Just as Caleb had chosen to leave for his sake, Julian was now choosing to keep his distance for Caleb's. He told him he should find a normal alpha, that they should respect each other's choices. Caleb was shaking with fury and grief. He told him fine, he would go find Marcus Thorne, who had recently expressed an interest. Julian's jaw clenched, and he ground out a single word. Whatever. That was it. The final thread of Caleb's control snapped. A sharp, itching pain erupted from his gland. He tore off his patch, letting his own scent flood the room, sharp and sweet with the onset of an unplanned heat. He gave Julian an ultimatum. He could mark him and they would face whatever came together. Or he could do nothing and watch him lose his mind right here. He told Julian, his voice shaking, that he had no interest in other alphas. If Julian wouldn't have him, he would wait until Julian died, and then he would follow him. He always kept his promises. Julian's composure crumbled. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He had tried so hard to protect him, to keep him safe from his own broken body, but he was powerless against this. He knew Caleb meant every word. He closed his eyes, a self-deprecating smile on his lips. It was always a losing battle. He had been lost from the moment Caleb walked back through that door. He stepped forward and brushed the tear from his own face. Then, in a choked whisper, he agreed. They would die together. A wave of triumphant relief washed over Caleb. He surged forward, his lips meeting Julian's, not with passion, but with a reverent tenderness. He kissed the salty track of the tear, as if he could erase all the years of pain. Julian's arms wrapped around him, holding him tight. This was his Caleb, the one who had run away and the one who had come back. Following his oldest instinct, he buried his face in the curve of Caleb's neck. Caleb's voice was a husky plea. "Julian, mark me." The moment the words left his lips, he felt the sharp pressure of Julian's teeth against his gland. The world dissolved into a dizzying blend of rose and pine. His body went limp, all heat and sensation, held up only by Julian's embrace. Julian's pheromones poured into him, a gentle, possessive claim. It was their first true bond. He tilted his head back, watching the ecstasy on Julian's face. After everything, Julian was still his alpha. Julian didn't complete the mark, still terrified of the consequences. They spent the next few days in a state of nervous vigilance, but Caleb felt better than ever. He begged for a full marking, but Julian insisted on seeing a doctor. They ran a battery of tests. The elderly doctor peered at them over his glasses, his eyes wide. He called it a miracle. Julian's damaged gland produced abnormal pheromones, but Caleb's late-stage, secondary presentation as an omega meant his own gland was uniquely receptive. They were a perfect biological match. The doctor added that Julian's PDS was already showing signs of stabilizing. Walking out of the clinic, they looked at each other, then burst into laughter. Caleb playfully punched his arm, complaining that they could have avoided all this drama if Julian had just marked him on the first night. Julian came up behind him, wrapping his arms around his waist. He nipped at his neck, murmuring that they could just call it foreplay. Caleb leaned back into his embrace, a genuine smile spreading across his face. He felt Julian's hand slip under his shirt. "I'm ready," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Let me give you a full mark. Is that okay?" Caleb tilted his neck, baring his gland completely. He answered with a single word. "Yes."